A woman walks out of a courthouse, finalizes her divorce, and feels like she's finally free. She's taken all the right steps. Filed for protective order, warned the authorities, documented everything. But what happens next isn't freedom. It's execution. On the afternoon of April 25th, 2024, 44-year-old Marjorie Crystal Evans sat in her parked vehicle outside the Spalding County Courthouse in Griffin, Georgia. Moments earlier, she had been inside the courthouse, concluding a legal battle that had consumed her life for over a year. But just as she was preparing to leave, a black car pulled up beside hers. Inside was Tom Mallory, her ex-husband. He exited his vehicle, pulled out a firearm, and shot Crystal multiple times through the window. It was broad daylight. People were watching. There were sheriff's deputies nearby. It didn't matter. Crystal had warned friends, family, and the public. She had posted online that she feared for her life. She had even described her ex-husband's threats, direct, dangerous, and repeated. And just days before the shooting, she secured a permanent protective order against him. So how did a woman who did everything the system asked still end up dead? This is not just a story about one woman's murder. It's about a justice system that couldn't stop it, a man living a double life, a protective order that failed, and a courthouse that turned into a crime scene. Who was Marjorie Crystal Evans? What secrets did she expose? What did the law know and when? And could her death have been prevented?
There are calls for justice after a woman was shot and killed outside the Spalding County Courthouse. Crystal Evans and her ex-husband, Tom Mallory, were at the courthouse Friday afternoon. They were there for a hearing when Mallory allegedly shot Evans a number of times, killing her. Investigators say he ran from police and eventually shot himself, but he survived.
Stay with us as we unravel the shocking story and uncover the heartbreaking details of what led to this senseless loss. If you enjoy real crime stories that uncover the truth, don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us share real cases, spread awareness, and give a voice to those who can't speak for themselves. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what are your thoughts as the story unfolds. Welcome to True Crime Tales, where we reveal the crimes that shock communities and the secrets hidden behind closed doors. These are real people, real events, real consequences. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's begin. Marjorie Crystal Evans, also known by her married name Crystal Mallory, was a 44-year-old woman residing in Griffin, Georgia. At the time of her death, she worked professionally in real estate and was described by those who knew her as someone who maintained a strong work ethic. She had several children and spent most of her adult life married to one man, Tom Mallory. Crystal and Tom were married for 27 years. During that time, she played the role of wife, mother, and career woman. From the outside, the marriage appeared stable. There were no major public incidents early on. To neighbors, acquaintances, and professional colleagues, the couple seemed typical, long-standing partners raising a family and building a life together. Crystal was active in her community. She maintained a presence on social media and documented aspects of her life publicly. In the months leading up to her death, those posts took on a different tone. She began writing about personal safety concerns. She warned followers that she was in danger. Specifically, she said if anything happened to her, her ex-husband would be the one responsible. These posts included allegations that Tom Mallory was living a double life. Crystal did not disclose all the specifics in the posts, but implied that there were hidden relationships, secret financial activities, or undisclosed threats that she had uncovered. She posted screenshots of alleged messages and alluded to being followed, intimidated, and threatened. Crystal also used her platform to draw attention to what she described as a lack of adequate protection from law enforcement. According to her posts, she had made reports, sought help, and was not taken seriously. The posts revealed growing concern that the system would not intervene until it was too late. Crystal met Tom Mallory in early adulthood. The exact date of their initial meeting is unclear, but records indicate that the two were together for approximately 27 years. Their relationship began when both were young and continued into middle age. During this period, they married, raised children, and presented themselves as a long-standing family unit. According to available background, the couple shared multiple children who were raised together in their Georgia home. Their relationship remained publicly intact for decades, with no visible legal or police interventions until much later. This stability, however, began to unravel in the last few years of their marriage. Multiple reports indicate that the breakdown of the marriage involved accusations of infidelity and deception. Crystal began to suspect Tom of engaging in affairs. She posted cryptic but direct messages about his behavior, referring to betrayals and dishonesty. She described moments where she realized that her husband was not the person she believed him to be. Some posts suggest she discovered another woman or learned of undisclosed financial activities involving their assets. The phrase double life became a recurring term in her posts. This may have referred to Tom maintaining relationships with other women, hiding money, or conducting illegal or unethical activities without her knowledge. Whatever the specifics, Crystal believed she had uncovered something significant and dangerous. Alongside these suspicions came escalating emotional tension. Crystal began describing the environment in her household as threatening. In text messages and social media captions, she stated that her husband was making verbal threats. She referenced situations in which she felt watched, cornered, or intimidated. There is no indication that Crystal filed criminal charges early in the process. Instead, she attempted to manage the situation by documenting it online, alerting friends and family, and seeking legal protection in court. This ultimately led her to file for separation and begin the divorce process. The emotional and psychological pressure intensified as the legal battle unfolded. Crystal pursued a protective order, citing repeated threats and fear for her safety. In these filings, she referenced verbal altercations, an episode that made her feel unsafe. The court granted her a temporary protective order while evaluating the case. As the divorce proceedings progressed, Crystal made additional posts, stating that she believed she was being followed. She claimed her ex-husband continued to make threats even with the legal order in place. The divorce was contentious and marked by increasing hostility, particularly from Tom Mallory's side, according to her account. 2 days before she was murdered, Crystal was granted a permanent protective order by the court. This legal document was designed to prevent Tom from contacting, approaching, or threatening her in any form. However, there was no formal police protection assigned to her. There were no surveillance measures, no enforced buffer zones, and no required police escort during her scheduled court appearances. Crystal's last few posts suggested that she knew time was running out. She expressed doubt that the legal system would act fast enough. She repeated the warning. If something happened to her, everyone would know who was behind it. These statements were not vague. They were time-stamped, published on public platforms, and visible to friends, relatives, and strangers alike. Screenshots circulated widely after her death, reinforcing the idea that she had predicted what was coming. Crystal's warnings did not result in any preemptive action. Despite the threats she described, the court process continued as normal. The protective order remained on file, but enforcement relied on Tom Mallory voluntarily complying. There were no active police measures surrounding her movements, even on the day of the final court hearing. This history of long-term emotional control, suspected infidelity, financial secrecy, and verbal intimidation set the stage for what would later become a fatal encounter. It revealed a high-conflict separation, in which one party was vocal about feeling unsafe and the other party was subject to legal restrictions, but not actively monitored. The breakdown of the marriage between Marjorie Crystal Evans and Tom Mallory transitioned from personal conflict into a legal battle during the months leading up to her death. After 27 years of marriage, Crystal began the process of separation by filing for divorce. The initial divorce petition was submitted in the early part of 2024. At the time, Crystal had already expressed concerns about her husband's behavior, which she described as manipulative, threatening, and controlling. Following the divorce filing, Crystal and Tom were scheduled for multiple court appearances. These hearings were part of the formal process of dissolving the marriage, addressing property division, custody arrangements, if applicable, and personal protection concerns. During these proceedings, Crystal repeatedly raised alarms about her safety. She alleged that Tom had been stalking her, sending threatening messages, and showing up uninvited at locations where she was present. Due to these concerns, Crystal applied for a temporary protective order shortly after initiating the divorce. This temporary order was intended to establish legal boundaries, restricting Tom Mallory from making contact or approaching her. The court granted the temporary order, but enforcement of such orders often depends on the actions of the individual named in the document. There were no reports of consistent monitoring or law enforcement protection assigned to Crystal during this time. Throughout the separation, Crystal continued to document patterns of intimidation. She told the court that Tom was following her, calling her phone excessively, and appearing at her residence or workplace without warning. These behaviors, as described in court filings and personal communications, matched the legal criteria for stalking and harassment. In the months leading up to the final protective order, Crystal continued to attend scheduled court appearances. She maintained a record of each incident she claimed involved threats or intimidation. Reports indicate that she attempted to strengthen her legal protection by requesting a permanent protective order, citing escalating behavior and her belief that her life was in danger. On April 23, 2024, just 2 days before her death, the court officially granted a permanent protective order. This order legally prohibited Tom Mallory from contacting, approaching, or threatening Crystal in any form. It was meant to provide longer-term legal protection, especially in light of the claims Crystal had made during the previous hearings. However, despite the legal document being finalized, no immediate physical protection was offered. Crystal was not assigned law enforcement detail, and no security measures were implemented at the courthouse for her next scheduled appearance. Her claims were documented in court, but there was no indication that authorities treated her case as a high-level threat requiring emergency intervention. During the months of legal conflict, Crystal turned to social media to share her experiences. Her posts served as a form of public documentation. She described her ex-husband as dangerous, manipulative, and abusive. These posts were not vague or speculative. She explicitly named Tom Mallory and warned that if anything happened to her, he would be responsible. Crystal posted multiple screenshots of text conversations, social media messages, and interactions that she claimed showed Tom's threatening behavior. These posts included descriptions of stalking incidents, unwanted visits to her property, and alleged surveillance efforts. According to Crystal, Tom was monitoring her movements, following her car, and using mutual acquaintances to track her activities. Her posts also criticized the legal and law enforcement response to her situation. She stated that despite reporting the threats and filing for protection, she felt law enforcement was not taking her seriously. She made several references to being dismissed, ignored, or told that there was little officers could do without physical evidence of an immediate threat. In one particular post, Crystal wrote that she feared going to court alone and believed Tom would do something during one of the hearings. She requested additional security but was not granted a police escort or courthouse protection. She expressed frustration that, even after filing multiple reports and receiving a protective order, she was still vulnerable. Outside of social media, Crystal communicated directly with friends and family, voicing fears about her safety. Text messages and private conversations revealed that she believed she was being watched. In one message, she stated that Tom had parked outside her home for hours without speaking, simply sitting in his car. In another, she wrote that he had followed her from work to a gas station and then circled the block multiple times. Crystal also sent voice notes to friends in which she described feeling constantly on edge. She said she avoided routine patterns, changed her daily schedule, and avoided places she used to visit regularly. She believed Tom was using mutual connections to gather information about her movements. In one series of messages, Crystal described her attempt to speak with courthouse personnel about security arrangements. She asked whether someone could walk her to her car after court hearings. She also asked whether Tom could be required to arrive separately and at a different time. Her requests were reportedly met with procedural explanations, but no additional security was provided. By the time the permanent protective order was granted, Crystal had left behind a digital trail of warnings, messages, and social media posts that laid out her fear in detail. She had told her audience, her legal representatives, and law enforcement that she believed she was at risk. She had made it clear that she felt unprotected and that legal documents alone were not going to stop her ex-husband. 2 days after receiving the permanent protective order, Crystal was scheduled for another court appearance. She documented her arrival at the courthouse on social media. It would be her final post. What followed was a fatal encounter that confirmed the exact danger she'd been warning about for months. April 25, 2024, began as a scheduled legal proceeding in Spalding County, Georgia. After months of contentious legal filings, emotional social media posts, and escalating allegations, the divorce between Marjorie Crystal Evans and Tom Mallory was officially finalized in court on that date. Court records confirmed that both Crystal and Tom were present in the courthouse that morning. The final hearing addressed unresolved matters related to custody, property division, and enforcement of the permanent protective order that had been issued just 2 days earlier. The legal separation was concluded, and Crystal legally regained full autonomy from Tom Mallory after nearly 3 decades of marriage. After the hearing, surveillance cameras outside the Spalding County Courthouse captured Crystal walking out of the building. She exited alone and showed no visible signs of distress or urgency. Footage confirmed she was dressed in neutral clothing and carrying personal belongings in her hands. She walked directly to her parked vehicle, located in the adjacent lot just a few yards from the courthouse entrance. Notably, Crystal had no police escort, despite having expressed fear for her life in the days leading up to this event. And despite the existence of protective order, there were no officers specifically assigned to accompany her to or from the courtroom. Surveillance footage shows multiple deputies stationed outside the courthouse, performing general duties. However, none interacted directly with Crystal or escorted her to her vehicle. At approximately 12:11 p.m., another vehicle entered the lot. The vehicle was a dark-colored sedan, later identified as belonging to Tom Mallory. According to the footage and eyewitness accounts, the vehicle pulled into the lot and parked just a short distance from where Crystal's vehicle was located. Tom exited the car holding a firearm. The following sequence occurred in less than 30 seconds. As Crystal was seated inside her car, preparing to drive away, Tom approached from the driver's side. Without any verbal interaction recorded on video, he raised the weapon and fired directly into the window. Multiple rounds were discharged into the front seat compartment. Crystal Evans was struck multiple times. Emergency responders were called by witnesses who heard gunshots. However, by the time first responders arrived, Crystal was unresponsive. Paramedics confirmed that she was deceased at the scene. The final shots were fired at close range and were immediately fatal. Following the shooting, Tom Mallory fled the scene. His vehicle was recorded leaving the courthouse lot at a high speed. Deputies responded within minutes to secure the area and begin the initial investigation. An alert was immediately issued for Tom Mallory's vehicle. Police began coordinating with surrounding jurisdictions to locate the suspect. Given the public nature of the crime, occurring in a government parking lot in broad daylight with visible surveillance, the urgency was high. Officers from the Griffin Police Department, Spalding County Sheriff's Office, and Georgia State Patrol were activated. Several hours later, officers located Tom Mallory approximately 20 miles away in a rural area outside Griffin. He had attempted to take his own life by gunshot. When officers arrived, they found him in his car, suffering from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Despite the severity of the wound, Tom Mallory was still alive. Emergency responders transported him to a nearby hospital under heavy law enforcement supervision. He was placed under medical care in critical condition, and law enforcement immediately placed him in custody as a suspect in the homicide of Crystal Evans. While Mallory remained hospitalized, the legal system moved forward. The Griffin Judicial Circuit District Attorney's Office filed formal charges against him. The charges included felony murder for the intentional killing of Crystal Evans with malice aforethought, aggravated assault for discharging a firearm at close range with the intent to kill or cause severe bodily harm, possession of a firearm during the commission of felony for using a handgun while actively committing a violent criminal act. These charges were supported by multiple pieces of evidence, including surveillance footage from the courthouse exterior cameras, eyewitness testimony from individuals in the parking lot at the time of the shooting, ballistic evidence matching the firearm used to the shell casings recovered at the scene, digital and forensic data linking Tom Mallory to the crime, including prior threats posted or sent to the victim and protective order that was in place. Law enforcement secured both the crime scene and the hospital where Mallory was being treated. He remained in custody during his hospital stay, with officers stationed outside his room around the clock. Legal documents were processed to ensure that, if he survived his injuries, he would be transferred directly to a detention center without bail. Local officials, including representatives from the sheriff's office and the district attorney, confirmed that the case was being handled as a domestic homicide. There were no other suspects or persons of interest. Law enforcement confirmed that Crystal Evans had taken multiple steps to seek protection prior to the incident, including obtaining the protective order and making public statements that she feared for her life. The death of Crystal Evans prompted renewed discussion in the local media and among community members about the effectiveness of protective orders in domestic violence cases. Her posts, in which she warned that her husband might try to kill her, circulated widely in the aftermath of her murder. These public warnings, combined with the timeline of events and the lack of active police intervention, despite documented concerns, generated significant public scrutiny. However, from a procedural standpoint, law enforcement and court officials followed standard legal protocols. The protective order had been issued. The divorce proceedings were conducted in court. There were deputies on site at the courthouse. Crystal was not physically assaulted or threatened inside the courtroom or the building. The attack occurred immediately after the court process concluded, outside in a public parking lot. The criminal case against Tom Mallory remains active pending final legal resolutions. The district attorney has indicated that if Mallory survives the self-inflicted injuries, he will face prosecution under the full extent of Georgia criminal law. If he does not survive, the case will be closed as a murder-suicide with formal documentation and forensic evidence retained for public record. Following the fatal shooting of Marjorie Crystal Evans outside the Spalding County Courthouse, her family released public statements expressing both grief and outrage. Most notably, her adult daughter stepped forward to issue a detailed and strongly worded condemnation of the local sheriff's office. Her statements were broadcast across social media and quickly gained attention from local media outlets and advocacy groups. According to Crystal's daughter, the Spalding County Sheriff's Office failed to protect her mother in spite of multiple documented warnings and repeated requests for assistance. She claimed that Crystal had asked for a police escort during her scheduled court appearance, a request that was allegedly denied. The daughter insisted that Crystal had communicated to the authorities that she feared for her life and that her ex-husband posed a credible threat. She accused deputies of refusing to take these fears seriously and alleged that her mother was told no personnel were available for an escort on the day of a hearing. She also pointed to previous incidents where Crystal had allegedly contacted the sheriff's office regarding threats from her ex-husband, Tom Mallory. According to the daughter, those reports were either downplayed or outright ignored. She claimed her mother had been treated as if she were overreacting or exaggerating the situation. She accused the sheriff's office of negligence and stated that the entire situation could have been avoided if the department had acted on any of the warnings Crystal had given in the weeks leading up to the shooting. The family asserted that Crystal had specifically requested police protection for her court appearance. They claimed this request was made both verbally and in writing, and had been submitted as part of her legal filings surrounding the permanent protective order. They stated that Crystal had told multiple people, including court officials and law enforcement, that she was afraid her ex-husband might attempt something violent at the courthouse. These statements were allegedly dismissed or not followed up with any formal security measures. In addition to issuing public statements, the family began demanding a full investigation into law enforcement response. They questioned why a woman with a recently granted permanent protective order was not given at least minimal security. They also asked why Tom Mallory was allowed to approach the courthouse at the same time and whether any effort had been made to prevent the two from encountering each other. The daughter's public comments began to circulate widely online and drew sympathy and anger from the local community. Although the family acknowledged their grief, their public tone was focused more on accountability than emotion. They said Crystal had done everything the legal system told her to do, including filing for divorce, obtaining a protective order, and informing police of threats. Yet she was still unprotected when it mattered most. The family began calling for state-level reforms in how protective orders and court safety protocols are handled in Georgia. In response to mounting public criticism, Spalding County Sheriff Darrell Dix held a press conference to address the accusations. The event was covered by local media and broadcast live on several digital platforms. Sheriff Dix began by expressing condolences to the family, but quickly transitioned to defending the actions of his department. Sheriff Dix stated that, according to official records and internal review, Crystal Evans never submitted a formal request for an escort on the day of the court hearing. He said no official request was documented in writing or logged in their communication systems. He emphasized that while his office was aware of the protective order, they had no reason to believe there was a specific threat plan for that day. To reinforce his point, Sheriff Dix presented surveillance footage from courthouse security cameras. The footage showed Crystal walking unaccompanied and appearing calm as she approached the courthouse entrance. Sheriff Dix stated that she did not look distressed or indicate to any court officer that she needed assistance. He used the footage to challenge the family's claim that she had begged for protection at the courthouse. The sheriff also addressed the history of domestic violence claims between Crystal and her ex-husband. He confirmed that multiple incidents had been reported, but said that both parties had filed complaints against each other at different times. Sheriff Dix argued that the situation was legally complex and did not involve a clear, one-sided pattern of abuse, at least based on the initial reports filed with his department. However, he acknowledged that Crystal had been granted a permanent protective order just days before the shooting. While denying negligence, Sheriff Dix did admit that the legal system has limitations when it comes to enforcing protective orders. He stated that unless an order specifically mandates police presence or is tied to a criminal case, enforcement typically relies on voluntary compliance. He added that resources are limited and escorts are not automatically provided to every person with protective order unless there is a confirmed, immediate threat. Sheriff Dix concluded the press conference by saying his department would cooperate with any state-level review of the case, but he rejected the notion that deputies had ignored direct pleas for help. The aftermath of Crystal Evans' murder sparked a wave of community outrage and debate across Georgia. Within days of the shooting, local residents began organizing protests outside the Spalding County Courthouse. Demonstrators held signs calling for justice for Crystal and demanding accountability from law enforcement. Several groups organized candlelight vigils, pressuring officials to re-examine security protocols and victim protections. The online response was also swift and intense. Hashtags such as hashtag Justice for Crystal and hashtag Protect Victims began trending locally on platforms like Twitter and Facebook. Many social media users reposted Crystal's final messages, including her warnings about her ex-husband and screenshots of protective order. Public sentiment overwhelmingly blamed the system for failing to act despite repeated red flags. Domestic violence prevention advocates used the case to highlight what they described as systemic gaps in court security and protective order enforcement. Representatives from local shelters and advocacy groups argued that protective orders were often treated as symbolic rather than actionable. They called for major reforms, including mandatory law enforcement escorts for individuals appearing in court against people named in active protective orders, improve coordination between court officers and police departments to track high-risk domestic violence cases, automatic security flags for victims scheduled to attend hearings involving former abusers, real-time enforcement tools for protective orders, including digital alerts and GPS monitoring for known offenders. State legislators were also pulled into the conversation. Several Georgia representatives began drafting proposals to revise the enforcement of protective orders and expand courthouse safety measures. Lawmakers called for hearings to examine how the state could prevent similar cases in the future. In Griffin and surrounding communities, the conversation shifted from a singular incident to a broader critique of the legal system's treatment of domestic violence survivors. While emotions ran high among supporters and advocates, many commentators kept their focus on legal gaps, enforcement failures, and the need for structural change. Marjorie Crystal Evans followed the legal process. She filed for divorce, reported threats, and successfully obtained protective order against her ex-husband, Tom Mallory. On paper, the system had been used exactly as intended, but despite her efforts, the outcome was fatal. Crystal's death highlights multiple failure points in the legal process, particularly when it comes to enforcement, communication, and real-time protection for high-risk individuals. One of the most critical gaps was the enforcement of protective orders. Crystal had a temporary protective order issued earlier in the separation process. She later received a permanent protective order just 2 days before her murder. However, protective orders are only as effective as the enforcement mechanisms behind them. No law enforcement personnel were stationed with her. There were no patrols around her home. No officer was present to ensure her safety at the courthouse, even on the day she was scheduled to appear for a legal proceeding. Tom Mallory was under legal instruction not to contact or threaten her, yet there were no electronic monitoring devices placed on him. He was not under house arrest, GPS tracking, or active supervision. He was free to move without any barrier beyond a written legal directive. Another failure point was communication between courts and deputies. While the protective order was legally valid, it's unclear how quickly the details of that order were communicated to all relevant law enforcement officers in Griffin, Georgia. There was no coordinated response. The courthouse, the deputies present, and the law enforcement leadership in the area had no preventive strategy in place for her specific situation, despite multiple social media warnings and previous reports from Crystal herself. Crystal had made her fears public. She explicitly stated she believed she was being watched, threatened, and followed. In one of her final posts, she told her followers that if she was murdered, everyone would know who did it. Those posts received public attention, yet there was no official intervention to assess her threat level beyond the civil court proceedings. A third and more systemic issue is the lack of surveillance or immediate protection for high-risk individuals in domestic violence cases. There are no laws requiring physical police presence for people who have active protective orders, even when there is a documented pattern of threats or public safety concerns. Individuals in Crystal's position are often left alone to manage their own safety until a crime occurs. This model relies on reactive law enforcement rather than proactive intervention. In Crystal's case, that meant no escort to court, no officer stationed near her home, and no alarm system connected to emergency services. The only protections in place were legal documents, restraining orders, and court filings, which did nothing to physically prevent her killer from approaching her. The broader implications of Crystal's death extend beyond her case. It exposes systemic failure in how domestic violence threats are handled, especially in situations where the danger is well documented. Her death has become a reference point in Georgia for the risks victims face when a legal system moves too slowly or without coordination. In response, state lawmakers in Georgia have begun early-stage discussions about potential reforms, tentatively referred to as Crystal's Law. While no legislation has passed yet, there is growing pressure to increase protection for survivors. Proposed changes may include mandatory law enforcement escorts for victims attending court hearings, increased penalties for violating protective orders, and the use of electronic monitoring for high-risk individuals under restraining orders. After the fatal shooting of Crystal Evans at the Spalding County Courthouse, Tom Mallory was taken into custody by responding officers. He did not flee the scene. Instead, he was immediately placed under arrest and later hospitalized for a brief period due to self-inflicted injuries that occurred during or after the shooting. Initial reports confirmed that he had been in a distressed state, but was deemed stable enough for legal processing. Following his release from medical observation, Tom Mallory was transferred to the Spalding County Jail, where he was placed under suicide watch. His mental and psychological competency to stand trial is currently under review. Legal experts expect that the competency evaluation will determine whether criminal proceedings can move forward in the coming months. Pending the results of that evaluation, formal criminal charges have been filed, including first-degree murder, aggravated assault, criminal use of firearm, and violation of protective order. Each of these carries serious sentencing implications, including the possibility of life in prison without parole. The autopsy report for Crystal Evans has been completed. It confirmed that the cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds. The case file includes video surveillance footage from the courthouse, eyewitness testimony from bystanders, and social media documentation posted by Crystal in the weeks leading up to her murder. These materials are expected to play a key role in the upcoming criminal trial. In addition to the criminal case, Civil litigation may follow. Crystal's family is currently exploring the possibility of filing a wrongful death lawsuit. Potential defendants could include Tom Mallory himself, but also government entities or law enforcement agencies accused of negligence. These lawsuits would focus on whether sufficient steps were taken to protect Crystal once her fears were documented. Meanwhile, advocacy groups have begun campaigning for the passage of a new state law named in her honor, Crystal's Law. The law would seek to fill the gaps that her case revealed, including immediate protection for domestic violence victims, better communication between courts and law enforcement, and faster enforcement of court orders. Public attention to the case remains active, especially on social media. Posts tagged with hashtag Justice for Crystal and hashtag Crystal's Law have circulated widely. Community events and public memorials have taken place, with supporters demanding accountability and legislative change. News coverage has kept the case in the spotlight, ensuring that future hearings and legal decisions will be heavily scrutinized. The outcome of the competency evaluation is expected to be announced within the next few weeks. If Tom Mallory is declared competent, a grand jury will move the case into the trial phase. If he is declared incompetent, he may be transferred to a psychiatric facility until deemed stable enough to participate in his defense. Until then, the case remains active but unresolved. The legal system will continue its process, but Crystal Evans' murder remains a prominent example of how civil protections can fail when enforcement and communication break down. How should the legal system improve protection for domestic violence survivors with active court cases? Should police escorts, GPS tracking, or home surveillance be standard for high-risk cases? Do you think Crystal's public social media posts helped or endangered her more? Should victims share public warnings, or does it increase the risk? Should courthouses have mandatory police escorts for anyone with protective order? Would that have made a difference in Crystal's case? Who should be held accountable when protective order fails? The system or the individual? Is the fault with the abuser alone, or does institutional negligence play a role? What does this case reveal about hidden abuse in long-term relationships? How can society better identify and intervene in relationships that appear stable on the surface? If you found this story as gripping and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that uncover the mysteries behind these tragic events, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our latest stories, updates, and discussions. Thank you for joining us on this journey to seek justice and explore the truth. Together, we can make a difference. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.